At least you're here. So, but in the case, this was 1888, there were a series of murders of what they called unfortunates. And so sex workers, I mean, they used the word prostitutes at the time, really, those specific ones had a drinking problem. And what they would do is they could pay, for services, and then they could that would pay for their drinking. And so they were right on the streets. But what happened was there were between 3 and 15 murders, and so nobody's in agreement of who were the ones that were murdered by one person we call Jack the Ripper, but they usually call them the canonical 5. So I'll use those. The first one, August 31st. This first murder was Polly Nichols, and what happened was on a side street there were 2 main thoroughfares in the poor East End slums of London called Whitechapel. She was found at 3:45 by one of the police constable that she was on her back and her throat was cut right to the spine from ear to ear. Her tongue was out, so they knew that the offender, strangled her first. And the big thing about the Whitechapel murders is complete silence every single time. So no one around heard a thing. So at this time, so that was August 31st, and then 1 week later, there was less than a mile away in another street, Hanbury Street, in the backyard, this Annie Chapman, she was murdered. Not only was her throat cut, but the offender took the uterus. And the intestines were moved to over the shoulder and was going after the uterus. And that's what the police surgeon at the time said, that killer had to have had anatomical knowledge. So there's argument back and forth today if did this killer have anatomical knowledge, and most modern experts of surgery are convinced so.
Mike, use the mic.
Okay, so that's my wife. I need a yes, dear. So, but then, and also with Annie Chapman, that the only thing that the killer ever took on any of the women was on Annie Chapman a wedding ring and a keeper ring, and that was it. And at the time, they thought, well, the killer was trying to fake like he was robbing someone. So then the next thing, what happened was, that was September 8th, but then September 30th, the killer, Jack the Ripper, killed 2 women one evening. So it was Elizabeth Stride first, and it looked like he was interrupted because the throat was cut, and that was it. And then a man with a pony did interrupt, or the pony, it was dark, about 1 in the morning, and the pony backed up, and then there was his body right there. So then, less than 40 minutes later, not in the Whitechapel district, but across in the City of London, District of City of London, in Mitre Square, there was Catherine Eddowes, and not only did she have her throat cut, she had the uterus taken, and also the kidney was taken. So, and then in the month of October, nothing happened, but that's when Scotland Yard, they doubled their patrols, so did the City of London Police, doubled their patrols. So there would be reason why the offender would not have attacked anyone at the time. But then Mary Kelly was murdered indoors, and so the killer had hours with the body. So when we talk about serial killers, we talk about MO, modus operandi, and offender signature. MO is how the killer gets the job done without getting caught. Offender signature is the personality, attacking the face because they have bitter hatred of women, something, and that's what we see. So, and so the Brent Turvey, Dr. Brent Turvey, he looked at these murders, and he sees that the offender was not a sadomosexual serial killer like Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, where there's a sexual component to it. He sees this anger retaliatory, bitter hatred of women, and because again, the face was attacked, and also the uterus was taken on 2 different women. So what makes women different from men? So what happened was, Francis Tumblety was there at the time. He was actually a quack doctor, and he made his millions by scamming everyone. At the same time, he was very abusive to a lot of women. I have record on a lot of this. He had a bitter hatred of widow or maid, because they would take young men away from him, because he had a passion for young men. So he even though in New Orleans, 1881, a young man admitted that under oath that Tumblety would come to him because he said that on the side I would be a male prostitute. Now he has, at the time of the deposition, he was married with a bunch of kids, but at the time, 19, he would do that, and Tumblety did that, but also molested him. So he already paid him, but he put a knife to his throat and molested him. So he was into molesting, but at the time he saw that in that travel chest Tumblety had were surgical knives, and we know that Jack the Ripper likely used an amputation knife. So here's one suspect that has, connected to the surgical instruments. But Tumblety, he was in this area. So he was born in Rochester, New York, and in Ireland. But then during the potato famine, he and his family came over, and what happened was, in 1847, by 1848, he was working for a quack doctor. So he was on the canal boats between Buffalo and Rochester, going right through Gasport, selling, they thought it was pornographic material, that's what they called it, but what it was a French cures doctor who was an expert at gonorrhea, syphilis, masturbation, because that was evil back then. So all of that stuff, he had these booklets to talk about that. And then so Tumblety would sell that material. So, but then he crossed, that was for 6 years, but in 1856, he crossed into Canada, London, Ontario, ironically, and within 3 years, he became a millionaire by today's standards, going into Toronto. He was so good at it. He would scam anybody. So you would come in, and let's say, he's claiming he can cure all, cancer, everything. And you would come in, and an example under court, we have this young man said that, I came in because I have an acne problem. So I came in and he goes, oh, hello, by the way. You are a goner. You have consumption, tuberculosis. Good news though, I'm going to give you these pills for this price and that gold watch you have. And in 2 weeks, come on back and I can guarantee you that consumption will be gone. So he was so good at that, they believed him. And he had so many testimonies in the newspapers. And again, they call him the Prince of Quacks for a reason, because he was such a great quack doctor. But the problem with Canada, though, is that not the United States, but Canada, the surgeons there had lots of control, and so American doctors couldn't just claim that they have an MD and then practice in Ontario, but it was Canada West at the time. But they had to go in front of the surgeons and convince them that they were. So there was an oral discussion, oral conversation. And so Tumblety never did that, so he got in trouble for that. So that got him into organs. And so then we start seeing him really into organs, because back at that time, surgeons would give illustrated medical lectures with their organs that they collected. And then so within 3 years, he crossed through Canada, again, made millions. He was in St. John. A carpenter died under his care. So they wanted to find out if it was his medicine that killed him, so they did an autopsy. That evening, he tried to steal that man's organs. So within a year, the Civil War started. He was when General McClellan was in control of Washington, D.C., and there was an eyewitness, Colonel Dunham. He said that Tumblety invited all the officers, the eyes and ears of the general, because Tumblety wanted to convince that general that you should hire me or you should commission me as a surgeon. Well, since he'd never had a medical diploma, if he could be a surgeon in the Army, well, that's your diploma right there. So, but the general knew that this guy was just a quack. But what happened was at that time, in 1861, in the summer of 1861, that the Colonel Dunham said that all of his officers were introduced to him. He had an illustrated medical lecture, and his favorite part were all of his collection of uterus specimens. So this guy, and so my next book, by the way, but I have articles coming out, is about Tumblety's passion for these organs. And again here, so what happened is, in the year of the murders of Jack the Ripper, 1888, Tumblety was interviewed, and he said that he was constantly in dread of sudden death because of kidney and heart disease. And so here's, again, in the Civil War, he had a collection of uterus specimens. Here's Jack the Ripper who took the kidney, the heart, and 2 uterus specimens. Tumblety's the only one connected to the very organs. I mean, if you ask about any of the other suspects or any experts why those particular organs, they'll go, no reason. The killer just wanted to mutilate. Didn't matter what organ. So, but in this case, he's connected to those organs. So, but what happened was, he was arrested on suspicion of being the Jack the Ripper murders before November 7th, because he was there. You know, he was semi-retired, and he his passion was to go in the slums at night of every city he went. He was a transient. He would travel in every city, and he would travel, and then we'd go in the slums, hook up with these young men, molest them, but then there were cases where he would be very abusive to the sex workers. And so, but then when he was arrested on suspicion, nobody saw the murder, the Jack the Ripper murder, so they had nothing on anyone, so they could not take him to court. So, but they had him nailed on a misdemeanor charge of indecent assault, which is basically molesting young men. And they had him nailed on that one. They had 4 young men that were going to testify against him. But that was a misdemeanor charge, so he posted bail, sneaked out of the country, and the murder stopped. So, and then none of the British papers had anything about that story, that murders, because it was a closed session. It was the beginning of Scotland Yard closing that, hiding their interest in Francis Tumblety. He came back to America. So the question I always get is, if Tumblety was Jack the Ripper, a serial killer, then when he came back to America, were there any Ripper-like murders in America? Would you agree that's a valid question?
Yeah.
So now, if you look at the FBI website, they say one of the big misconceptions about serial killers is they continue to kill all the time. If you're sadomosexual, there's that impulse. Absolutely, that's going to happen. But anger retaliatory, not so much. But I decided to look. Honest to God, I found 39 unsolved murders of young women at night on the street, where I cannot eliminate Tumblety as having done it. Where I find them in the city, and not only that, it was every single one of these murders and assaults, and some of the stories are even more interesting. Every one was near train tracks or a train station. Even if it wasn't Tumblety, I'm convinced I found one or a couple serial killers that took advantage of the railways. Kind of like long-haul trucker serial killers. You know, it took decades for the FBI to catch up to these long-haul serial killers. Hundreds of, sex workers were, and just people that were walking the streets that got murdered because of these long-haul truckers. Just think in the 1880s, there was no FBI. Cross jurisdiction, they didn't communicate. So just think if there was a serial killer that was taking the train, stopping at a off at a train station, murdering a woman, getting back on and leaving, the detectives automatically assumed, for a good reason, that it was a relative, someone that knew the person, not a stranger, but a local farmhand or something. And then sadly, you could see that there were a lot of cases where I purposely ignored the ones that a court convicted a person, even though, would you agree that there's probably many times where convicted people were innocent, especially in the 1800s? And then so in this case, I just focused on the ones that were still unsolved to this day. And so that's what I would find. So not only that, 37 attempted murders or assaults, 3 in Buffalo, a murder in Buffalo, and then what would happen was, ever since the 1860s to 1898, Tumblety would travel through Rochester to Buffalo, which means he went through Gasport pretty much every year, almost every year. So did he stop here? May very well be, but he still had family. He had a brother still in Rochester till 1868, and a nephew said that the last time Tumblety was in Rochester was when his brother died. So that would be 1890, I'm sorry. So then, but we had, 37 unsolved. a cool example would be one. Oh, another thing is if Tumblety was a serial killer. Now, if you look at serial killers, they don't automatically start killing at age 4, 5, 6, and 7. There's a trigger that they're looking for. Now, they may lack remorse and realize, "Ooh, that was fun," but something has stopped them. But then something happens, like Eileen Wuornos, for example. She had a bitter hatred of teenage or middle-aged men, and so she was in Florida. She was prostituting herself, and in January she murdered, shot this man, and she claimed that man was abusing her. I'm convinced he was. But what happened was that was the first time she murdered, and then she liked it. Well, there was no murder for Eileen Wuornos. Didn't murder her for months, but then when she murdered again, she realized, oh, I got away with it. But then it was once a month, bam, 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 bam. So that was the trigger right there. So with Francis Tumblety, we found out, nobody knew this, that he was what they called a hermaphrodite. He had male and female parts. His penis was the size of the tip of his thumb, so it didn't work. So what I was looking for with the unsolved murders, sadly, most women that were murdered were also raped. They called it outraged in America. I was just looking in the U.S. only. So most women were raped too. So if they were outraged, and I look up for the coroner to confirm that that person was outraged, then I ignored that person. Well, what happened in the 1870s, I don't find any of these mysterious, what they call mysterious murders, where the victim was neither raped nor robbed for financial gain. Usually it was robbed or raped. But around 1880, I start seeing these pattern right here. And incidentally, that's when we see Tumblety changing his lifestyle, now going to Hot Springs, Arkansas, Hot Springs, Saratoga Springs, all these mineral springs, health springs. He claimed it was his rheumatism, but he had syphilis. He contracted syphilis because, and it was by a young man, but he was Catholic, and his family believed in a misconception back then. It's not doctrine, but it's not Adam that committed the original sin. It was Eve deceiving Adam. Therefore, women are the curse of the land, which includes all the original sin. All disease came on land because of the original sin. His condition was because of women. So it was a lifetime hatred. So I have reports of him even in his teenage years having a hatred of women. But what happened is, he claimed he could cure all things. Now he catches an incurable disease back then, syphilis, and it's a progressive disease. So at that time, there was a young woman. So Tumblety his residence was basically New York City, but the Grand Central Station goes to the northeast and goes into Connecticut. And there was a young woman that was murdered right there in 1880. Tumblety lost a court case to a woman, and because the son, Tumblety gave the son a power of attorney when he went across to Europe, and the woman and the son took a lot of money from him. So he went to court in New York City, and he lost that case. So here he's already raged that this woman did that, but within a month, there was a woman right on the train tracks, right there. Throat was cut ear to ear, and this long knife was stuck in her. She was mutilated as well. So, but again, she was neither raped nor robbed. So then next year was interesting. Tumblety still owned had an Indian herb station, a medical station, an office, in Manhattan, and 79 East 10th Street. So there was a woman in 1881, Ella Clark, that came to Manhattan to get an abortion. Well, she was going to a quack doctor, this Dr. Thomas. So she came to Grand Central Station. Her brother picked her up. Nobody knew about this. She just said that she had to go to a doctor. So then the brother dropped her off to Mrs. Kennedy's, her best friend, in Manhattan. So this woman was originally from Manhattan, but just a few years ago moved to Connecticut. So she was telling Mrs. Kennedy that she's going to go to Dr. Thomas to get taken care of. And so Mrs. Kennedy didn't know it was an abortion either. So what happened was she never came back. So she was staying at Mrs. Kennedy's house, residence. She never came back. And a month and a half later, they found her dismembered body in Long Island. The head was still with the body. The organs were missing, gone. Just the head was there. So the officials, they thought it was an abortion gone awry. It was a quack doctor, and that tried to hide the body. Well, not that I'm a serial killer, but back then the only way to identify a person is their face. So there are cases where dismembered bodies are without the head, and the head goes elsewhere, so they can't identify the body. Well, the head was with the body. It's just the organs were gone. So they went to Dr. Thomas. He had an ironclad alibi. He was not even in Manhattan at the time. So on this, you'd see it, but there's a map I have where here's Dr. Thomas's office. Here's where Mrs. Kennedy lived. Frances Tumbley's office was 2 blocks to the west. So she went to Dr. Thomas's office. We know that for sure because the secretary said that. And then she said that he's not here, so she went back, and she's from Manhattan, so she would have known other quack doctors, and there's only a few quack doctors, and those were the only ones that could perform abortions because that was illegal at the time. So here it is. Just think if you are this Frances Tumbley, like the fly is coming to the web. Don't tell anybody I'm here, but could you do an abortion? So what happened was, so then that woman went back to Mrs. Kennedy's and said, Dr. Thomas is going to do it in the morning, so I got to leave. So she left, and then next thing you know, missing. So, and that's kind of what it is it's not that Tumbley was arrested for this, but he was in the area. So there was another case where we have a woman in New Jersey. There's right across the border, there were these women that were being murdered along train tracks. They call it the Rahway Mystery because no one claimed who that was, probably a sex worker or something, but was murdered right along the train tracks. And then soon after, this other woman was murdered along the train tracks there. And we know where Tumbley was because, and that was on that date, just a week before, he said that he was sending money to the New York Herald, trying to show that he cares about people, and he's giving to a cause, so the New York Herald would publish that. So he said that he's in Philly on this day. A few days later, that woman was murdered there, and then New York City is here, and he was in New York City 2 days later. So he was at the crime scene, even if he was not the killer. So, what time is it?
2:30.
Is it 2:30? Okay,
Yep.
so then it keeps on going like this is where I just find these stories. By the way, all 76 murders and assaults of these women that I write about, you Google their name and you can't find them. Every single one was lost to history. So at least now they get a voice a little bit. So here it is, 1900. So Tumbley died in 1903. Oh, by the way, 2 years before the Ripper murders, he was hanging out with a neurosyphilis, who was an expert an expert of neurosyphilis, but he was an alienist, but he was an expert of neurosyphilis, and that's what Tumbley had just before the murders, and that affects the kidney and the heart in many cases. And so then soon after that, we see Tumbley always, he would dress in fancy clothes, but after that, he started dressing in just like in the slums. He would look like the slums. Even though he had thousands of dollars rolled up in one pocket, jewelry in the other, and when he would walk the slums, that he was dressed like just a homeless person. He would do that so if he got arrested for, some of the things, molesting young men, that he would say, I'm a higher status person. I should be treated like that. So he would show how much money he had and stuff. So, but what happened was, I thought by 1900, I would no longer see these mysterious murders. So what happened was in Texas, you'd see Tumbley always went to Hot Springs, Arkansas, at least twice a year. You take that train south and it goes into Jefferson, Texas, and it keeps on going and it goes right into Galveston, Texas. So what happened was these 2 young men were hanging out with this young lady at their house partying. She passes out. This is Jefferson, Texas. She passes out. So for a joke, the 2 men take her to the local train station, put her in the waiting room, put a sticker on there, or a note saying, "Take me to San Antonio," just for a joke. Well, the next morning she was mutilated. So the two young men had an ironclad alibi because they went right to another party, and everybody saw them at the party, so they knew with the time of death that they estimated that it was not them. So what happened is the next major station is Galveston, and within 1 week was that major Galveston hurricane of 1900, the Galveston flood. Tumblety was a victim in there. So Tumblety was in Galveston, had to be along that same train track. So I just keep on finding these things. But someone might say, let's say that but we don't have any evidence for him doing that. Absolutely. But I named 10 modern day serial killers like Golden State Killer, all of them. If it wasn't for familial DNA or DNA, nobody would have known. They would have gone to their graves and we would have not known that they were the serial killers. So it actually matches modern day serial offenders. But we do have record of him having this bitter hatred, having surgical instruments during the Ripper murders, and again being connected to those organs. And I'm sure there's much more. But are there any questions?